Okay.
You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name. Politics is our game. And we will be doing, well, actually we'll be doing political economy this evening because we have as our guest not a politician, although somebody who knows some public policy, who knows some politics. And our guest this evening is Professor Edward Stuart. He is Professor Edward Stuart Emeritus. He's at the Northeastern Illinois University. It's right over here on Chicago, on the border, really, on the north side of Chicago, right?
Exactly. Yeah, Lincolnwood and Chicago, and Sauganash.
All right, so you've been teaching about 25 years, maybe longer.
Yes.
We're not going to quibble over the number of years.
Yes, that's long
You
enough.
know this stuff cold. You know macroeconomics. You know, folks, if you haven't taken economics lately, remember, big division in economics between microeconomics, sort of looking at the individual and the firm, macro looking at the whole aggregate for the economy. And yeah, the post 2008 recovery, we had this big crash in 2008. We've had a recovery for 4 years, but it's a fact that it's been the least robust in the last 60 years, post-World War II economic recovery. We've had a number of recessions, a number of recoveries. Absolutely, this is the worst one, right?
Right.
Worst recovery.
Yes.
How come?
The recession was the worst one. It was a financial recession as opposed
But
to...
if it's worse, it should bounce back. Remember the thing, it's like a string. If you pull it down, it bounces up. So
Not
you go
necessarily.
down, you go back up, right?
In non-financial recoveries, you do that because the string, it's a good analogy, we could take that for the Paul Volcker recession of 82, 83, because some of you will remember
The Reagan,
82,
the
83.
robust Reagan recovery.
Right.
RRR, robust Reagan recovery.
Right.
Notice the alliteration. Okay.
Yes, yes, good. 82, 83, inflation's running at 15, 16%. I'm sure you had some kind of money market fund. I had one that was paying 17% interest on an annual basis. Inflation was running at 17%.
Right. So you're making zero return.
Exactly.
It sounded good, 17%,
It sounded good, yeah.
but the real rate of return, if you got inflation of 17%,
wasn't
nominal
much.
rate 17%,
Right.
it's zero. Right?
Yeah, but it was better than having your money in a savings account that was paying 2 or 3%. Anyway.
No, not really, because if you have it, if you're in the savings, just stop you for 1 second. If the savings account is paying 3% now,
No.
or
Back
even
then.
then, oh, of course,
Yes.
of course. But now, I thought you meant now people
No,
are getting
no.
those kinds of returns,
No.
but there's relatively low inflation. The real
Right.
rate of return might actually be
Be
higher
better-
now
might be better
than
now.
it was 82,
Right.
83. Okay.
So, go back to 82, 83. Paul Volcker is the chairman of the Fed. We're going to stop inflation. And he does that by ratcheting up the federal funds rate, the discount rate, to 15, 16%. Pulls on the string. The economy goes into what was at that time the steepest recession post-World War II. And in fact, in that recession, the unemployment rate was up to 10.8%, higher than it was in this current recession. But it was a recession caused by the Federal Reserve interest rate. It was not a financial recession. It was not a housing recession. It was not a stock bust recession. It was a Federal Reserve created recession, and they could stop it.
And the monetarists would say at the time, from the University of Chicago, the mistake Volcker made, first they were too loose with the money stock, creating that high rate of inflation. It wasn't the interest rate so much, they would say, it was the high rates of growth of the money stock.
Yeah.
And then they cut back on the rate of growth of the money stock, which caused interest rates initially to go higher, caused the recession as people cut back on spending.
Right.
But then as inflation came down, interest rates came down
That's
as well,
right.
nominal rates of interest.
Eventually.
And the recovery started, and we had the robust Reagan recovery
With
of 82, 80. And
substantial-
unemployment went way down.
With substantial increases in federal spending, in state government spending, and in local government spending.
But
yes.
not as much as we had with Obama.
No,
you didn't have an $800 billion
no,
stimulus, did you?
Much different. Much different.
less?
Much more under Reagan increases in state and local government spending. We've had cutbacks in state and local government
But
spending.
again, Reagan didn't control that. State and local
Whether
could
he
do what they
controlled
want.
it or not, we're talking about whether there was fiscal stimulus behind the 82, 83 recovery or behind this
The problem
recovery.
with saying that is state and local governments can't really run deficits like the Fed
I
can.
know. They didn't run deficits in 82, 83
so if they
because
run,
the federal government was giving them money.
But if they're increasing their spending, they're also increase taxes. Some Keynesians
No,
would
they
say
weren't.
Keynesians would say that doesn't have a stimulus effect. They can't run deficits in the state and local level.
But they
can on the federal
they
level.
were increasing their spending not through tax revenues but through federal revenue sharing.
What Well, okay, then you're saying that, but then the Feds were running essentially deficits, is
Right.
what you're saying.
And that was part of the recovery. There was a huge deficit under Reagan, right? Big
Well,
deficit.
not anything like Obama. Obama
Yes,
was running
a bigger percentage of
No,
GDP.
but not. Well, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, I think because Obama got up to like 9 and 10%, higher than anybody else. We'll have to check that.
Yeah.
Let somebody fact check and find out who got it right. Did Berkowitz screw up again? All right. Okay, but we're sort of getting off. We're using this conventional times, what they were using then, Keynesian economics,
Right.
monetarism.
Right.
Along comes 2008. It's not monetary policy per se, some would argue it is, that caused problems because some would say it caused the bubble. It's not fiscal policy. You had this, remember they said it was a freezing up of credit.
Right.
And along comes Democrats and Republicans, arm in arm, Obama, McCain, essentially one favoring a $700 billion bailout. Obama gets elected. Obama has an $800 billion stimulus program.
Right.
He says, adopt this and unemployment won't go above 8%. They adopted it, unemployment went to 10%, and we had this very slow recovery. And we still have unemployment, we're taping this on March 6, 2013, more than 4 years after Obama came in, and yet we have unemployment hovering in the 8% level.
Right.
Is that any way to run a railroad?
Yeah, the recovery started in June of '09. That's when the National Bureau of Economic Research dated the end of the recession.
Started, but it's been a very, very weak recovery. You would agree with that?
Oh yeah, and for very good reasons. We have not been very Keynesian. The stimulus was much too small.
$800 billion?
Much too small.
Wow.
Should have been twice as big.
Wow.
And it should have been much more spending and much less tax
Wouldn't
cuts.
we have had, would you have raised taxes?
No.
Well, then you would have had much larger deficits.
Right. Yes.
And you would recommend that.
Of course.
Even though we had $1 trillion deficits, you wanted to see, we almost had a $2 trillion deficit. You would like to see a $3 trillion deficit?
Oh yeah, I should. In World War II, the deficit was 30% of GDP. When I talk about World War II to my classes, I have relabeled
I
World War.
I go back and see that. I'd like to see that. When you send us that data?
30% of 30%.
When it come to your
GDP.
class, and we're going to have a debate. Okay.
I've relabeled World War II as the mother of all stimulus packages. Okay. We had huge deficits, huge deficits.
Okay, so now we
and
get
a recovery.
So now we get to the current.
Right.
Obama gets reelected.
Right.
Last year they had this thing called sequestration.
Right.
This agreement that, okay, Congress has some time, Republicans and Democrats, to work on cutting spending. If they can't work it out, this agreed upon cuts in defense spending, which Republicans didn't want, or discretionary non-defense spending, which Democrats didn't want, and now they're both stuck with this. Right. But it's a small pittance. It's not even 94 billion. The CBO says it's like 44 billion. It's you know, if you say what's the level now for GDP?
15 trillion.
$15 trillion. And so as a percentage of GDP, 42 billion is about 0.3%, not even a percent. And even if you did it as a percentage of government spending, it's maybe 1.5 to 3%, depending on whether you're saying it's 42 billion, 84. This is small stuff. If you're ever going to get your arms around, as people said, we're running $16 billion in debt now, $16 trillion in debt. Mm-hmm. Okay, still running $1 trillion deficits. Mm-hmm. You've got to cut spending. You would agree with that, don't you? At some point?
No.
Never?
Well,
you can
yes,
continue to run $1 trillion deficits?
You've got to cut spending maybe 5 years out, 10 years out, after the recovery.
5 years out, wow.
Yes, after the recovery has lowered the unemployment rate back to what's a natural rate.
Won't you have debt then, not 16 trillion? You might have 30 or 40 trillion dollars in debt.
Actually, all you got to do it. No, it'll. Once you.
No, but before you get the recovery that you're talking about, if you're running these large deficits, and right now, remember, folks, the difference between the deficit and the debt. The debt is it's a stock concept.
Right.
It's the amount of money you currently owe as a nation. It's not the nation owes to another nation, really. It's individuals in the United States and outside who own rights to be paid in the future. Right. And somebody else has to pay them. Right. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and that debt right now is 16 trillion.
You can argue about how big it is. Net debt. A lot of the federal debt is owed by one federal agency to another. So economists also talk about the net federal debt, and
Oh,
that's
yeah.
about
Well,
10 trillion.
Well, I don't know. We'll have to take a look at that. Yeah. Most people I know say 16 trillion.
Right.
That's a lot. GDP itself is only 16 trillion or less, so we're running about 100% of GDP in debt. You would like to maybe let it double, which would be 200%.
No, I don't think it's going to. I would not worry about it. It's not going to go to 200%, because the process is you increase spending now, government spending now. You push the economy faster, right? You get multiplier effects. You get economic growth. This is not rocket scientists. We did this in 1941 and 40.
Pure Keynesian economics.
Right.
And why do we call it Keynesian economics?
It was created by John Maynard Keynes, a great British economist who in 1936 wrote the most important book in economics in the 20th century, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And he was talking about the fact that in a recession, in a major recession, household sectors can't increase spending, business sector can't increase spending, you can't expect exports to do it, and that leaves you with only one other actor in the economy, and that has to be the government.
But would you agree that
And it was tested in World War II, and it worked.
Well, would you agree that the theory was sort of constructed to explain the Great Depression?
Right.
Keynes thought mistakenly that the Federal Reserve in the U.S. had been expansive on the money stock, but there was this...
No, he didn't think that.
Let me just finish, and then
Okay.
you can disagree. I think some would say he thought that, but there was this tremendous appetite, demand to hold money,
Right.
a liquidity trap.
Yep.
The more they increased money, he thought, the greater the demand, and therefore there was no effect on the economy.
Right.
And therefore, he said you had to use fiscal policy, not monetary policy.
Right.
But then along came Milton Friedman, Anna Schwartz, they studied this and found out that the money stock before the crash, as they call it or before the great, whatever you want to, before the great contraction,
Right.
in 29 and 30,
Right.
the money stock was cut by a third.
Right.
So Friedman said that's what caused it. It wasn't a liquidity trap and so forth. And I think most people would agree. That was the major cause of the Depression. If you cut the money stock by a third, folks, we're not talking cuts in rates of growth. That's what we talk about now. Maybe the Fed would lower the rate of growth from 4% to 2%. This was taking the absolute amount of money and cutting it by 33%.
Right.
You agree?
That was not a good thing to do, but that may have been more of an effect than a cause. There were a lot more causes. There was financial issues. The stock market was completely unregulated. There was Enrons from here to there. One of my favorite books on the causes of the Depression is John Kenneth Galbraith's The Great Crash, and he talks about a real estate boom in Florida. He talks about Goldman Sachs creating investment trusts, and he talks about the tremendous inequality of income, which prevented large parts of the population from having any spending and gave excess funds to the very, very wealthy who speculated with it.
So we're talking about this great debate that's been going on for the last, well, some would say it's over, but some say it went on mostly raging between Galbraith and Friedman
Right.
in the 60s,
Yep.
in the 70s, and the 80s.
Yeah.
Many would say Friedman won. Harvard now teaches it more the way I think I'm talking about it. And before, it was just Chicago. So Chicago and Harvard are in agreement, I think, about what I said. You may disagree. But in any case, moving ahead now, fiscal policy, you say Keynesian economics is still alive and
Yes.
well. Do you say monetarism is alive and well?
No.
You'd say
No.
monetarism has been defeated.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not taught anymore.
And so you're saying
Maybe at
that,
the University of Chicago, but not even there, I don't think.
You know, I think, John Taylor, people like that, Stanford, Hoover
Yeah.
Institution, I think they still think money matters.
Yeah,
We're not going
but
to
not
make the
so
whole
much.
show about that,
Yeah.
or even much of the show. The important point I was trying to make, I hope we made that jointly, is that people, if you trace out the period in the 1960 to 1980 to 1990 to 2000, you hear much of this discussion of fiscal policy, monetary policy, and then along comes 2008, we get to this crash, this freezing up of credit. It's sort of a different story. And then Obama comes along, some would say he's kind of an unreconstructed Keynesian. You would say he should have been more of a Keynesian.
He should have been much more Keynesian.
Okay.
Yeah, he spent too much time at the University of Chicago.
Well, I don't know. Some would say at Chicago, not enough. But in any case, so he tries a stimulus. You say it should have been larger.
Much bigger, right.
And now, to the current, though, some would say we've got to get our arms around the debt. We've got to start cutting back.
Yeah.
And Obama sort of agrees because that was sort of the agreement behind sequestration,
Right.
or whatever, probably mispronouncing it. But in any case, you're still saying these small cuts, which some would say they're like baby cuts, $43 billion out of a $15 trillion economy, they're hurting the economy, and we shouldn't be fooling around with that.
Exactly. And we have a spending problem in the United States, and the spending problem is we're not spending enough. In the fourth quarter of 2012, government spending went down.
Okay.
Federal government spending went down. State and local government spending has been going down for 2 or 3 years, consistently.
Well, but it's not so much because...
Yes,
Well, but the budget, if you take Illinois, we know something about the budget in Illinois.
Right.
We raised taxes, the income tax, by $5 to $6 billion. So total spending for the state of Illinois, which is matched by total revenue in large part in the last year, went up to like 35 or 36. The general revenue fund, depends what budget you use, went from 30 to $36 billion. And we just about had a balanced budget from that tax increase, but now the governor's saying he needs all that. It can't expire as it was intended, or he may be saying that. But so some would argue with you when you say it's been going down,
well, if you
because,
look at, if you look at
it went, now some would say that there was a major, that big tax increase was used for a pension payment, not for other spending like on education and so forth, but nevertheless, that is spending by the state government, right?
But most states have been cutting back on spending, and you can look at employment numbers. State employment is down throughout the United States.
Well, others would argue with you and say it's the rate of growth.
No, absolute numbers, and
Well,
decreases,
again,
decreases in spending.
Neither of us has a lot of empirical evidence to throw at each other and cite, and we'll have to have that debate.
Well, look at the
continue
GDP reports for the fourth quarter of 2012. Government spending went down. GDP was flat.
And that's on the federal level.
Right.
GDP actually was negative.
Right, but they've just done the
And they say it's positive slightly. But it wasn't good.
It wasn't good. It wasn't good. And the unemployment rate in January went up a little bit. So that's my point, is that yes, it may be a small amount, although to paraphrase the late Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen, a billion here, a billion there, pretty soon you're talking about real money.
Right.
That one of the things that Keynesians believe in—
Now we have to say a trillion here, a trillion there, pretty soon you're talking
about real money. Is what's called a multiplier process, that a dollar's worth of spending by the government, a dollar's worth of spending by business, a dollar's worth of extra spending by a household leads to further rounds of spending if there are increases in spending, and vice versa if there are decreases in spending.
The peculiar thing about that Keynesian argument, if you just stop there, if you were like a sophomore student or somewhat skeptical, and you said, okay, there's something called the balanced budget multiplier.
Right.
That is, if the government, say, raises spending by $300 billion
and
raises taxes by $300 billion, it'll actually increase GDP, the gross domestic product, by $300 billion. But if that's the case, why not, instead of making it $300 billion, why not make it $1 trillion? Why not make it $2 trillion? Because under this Keynesian theory, all you have to do is jack up government spending, jack up taxes by the same amount, and you get an increase in GDP. And some would say, oh no, don't even raise taxes. Just push spending up, you'll get a large deficit, you'll get GDP going over more.
Right.
And so the way, if you're saying this is the way to do it, just always run large deficits.
No, not always. I'm saying now.
No, but why? But
we should have run surpluses in 05 and 06.
You're saying demand,
there is an output
in a sense
constraint.
You're reversing Say's law, right? Because supply creates its own demand.
Right.
You're saying demand creates its own supply.
As long as there's supply out there. And there are 12 million people unemployed. And there's lots of
supply. And why are they
supply.
Unemployed?
Because there's no demand. It's
Are
very
you sure?
clear. Oh, yes.
Well, let me ask you this
good
question.
Evidence
Let me
that
let me
this
play
is a
devil's advocate.
Demand-driven
Let me
recession.
play devil's advocate. You live in Chicago, right? You know something about the Chicago public schools.
Right.
Do you know, and it's primarily minority, but not exclusively minority, 85% Hispanic and black. This statistic, I think even the Barbara Bird Bennett, the CEO, doesn't argue with when I asked her. 20% of the black kids in the 4th grade in the Chicago public schools read at grade level. 80% read below grade level.
Right.
80% read below grade level. I emphasize that because we're turning out high school graduates. If they're not reading at grade level in the 4th grade, they're not going to be reading it at the 8th grade, 12th grade. We'll talk about Runaway Bunny maybe as we close the show, but it's an important book, seriously. We're turning out tremendous numbers of kids and adults who can't read. And a lot of them are unemployed, and a lot of them join gangs because they can't read. And you're assuming if somebody's unemployed, oh, they're qualified, they're smart, they've got tremendous skills, and if only there were demand, there would be more output.
Right, there have been tests for that, and what you're making is the structural unemployment argument.
Right.
That we have these jobs that are available and people who are unemployed, but they don't fit the jobs. If that were
They
the
don't
case,
have the skills.
If that were the case, then the pay for the skill jobs where there's supposedly shortages would be going up. But there are no jobs where
haven't you seen the immigration? What is the number? We have certain people, immigrants who come in. They're very skilled. They're engineers and so forth from other countries.
But their salaries aren't going up.
Oh, those salaries are. Trust me. Okay.
There's no.
If you're an engineer, okay, and you've graduated like a double E electrical engineering, trust me, I know something about this. And say you have a law degree and you know IP. Oh, your salaries are going way up. No.
You may get a big salary, but there are not increases in those salaries.
Oh no, it is.
Or for skilled
I'll debate you on that every day of the week.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to improve GDP in this country, here's what I'm saying, folks, and here's the debate. And I think we set this up well, and then you folks can decide, okay? Because the question is, what determines output, real output?
Right.
And you're taking the view, and it's sort of a Keynesian view, it's aggregate demand. If you jack up that aggregate demand, you increase aggregate supply. I'm taking what's called the supply side view.
Right.
Okay? That you have to give incentives for people to work, save, and invest, and more importantly, you have to create skills. You have to train people. You have to teach them how to read. I mean, I know people who are investors. You know where they're investing now? Abroad. You know why? Because the ability of our kids are not learning how to read. Forget engineering, for statistics, they're not learning how to read. So go invest in countries abroad, outside the United States, where they're actually teaching kids how to read, and you'll make a higher rate of return outside the United States than inside. Do you know investors who are doing that?
No.
Do you think I'm just making that up? Or?
No, I'm sure that could be true, but those are maybe individual cases. That may be microeconomics and not macroeconomics.
I wonder if, well, okay. We've almost
Because
sort of exhausted
one of the problems with the demand idea, or one of the problems with demand, not the idea, is that most of the rest of the world is suffering from this austerity-induced sluggishness.
Not Sweden. You know why? Not Sweden. Have you looked at Sweden? You know why Sweden's doing well? Want to take a guess?
They're not doing that well. They have a slow GDP growth as well.
There are some people who think that I always bring it back to school vouchers and school choice. But it is true, and I just learned of this recently, that in Sweden they've adopted on the national level a school voucher, school choice program. Mm-hmm. And their educational system has improved markedly as a result. What do you think? You're somebody who teaches competition.
Yeah,
you know economics.
I'm not an expert on school policy or public choice. And if you look
but you're an expert you are an expert on economics. And wouldn't
right.
you expect if we had more competition, everything else stays equal, ceteris paribus?
I look at some of the OECD studies on education policy and choice and so forth, and it's one of those things where you can find evidence wherever you look. Finland is also doing great, and they have no vouchers in Finland, and it's complete public school. There's no private education.
Do you know the name of Herb Wahlberg, School Choice?
No.
Where do we have? Never find. Here we go. We got a bigger book to hold that up. School Choice by Herb Wahlberg, published in 2007. He looked at hundreds of findings. That's what it's called, the findings on school choice. I give you this, okay? Now, it has to be updated, but take a look at that. I think the evidence is overwhelming that choice schools, vouchers, charter schools, outperform traditional public schools. If you looked at the empirical evidence.
I don't think that's even true in Chicago.
Oh, I think it is true in Chicago.
I think
number one, we don't have any voucher programs in Chicago.
Well, we have charter schools in Chicago.
No, but that's a halfway house. That's a halfway house.
Well, they should do halfway better then.
Well, no, because, you know, again, from economics, isn't economics about individual empowerment? If individuals have control, if individuals have control and they can take their purchasing power and go from one company to another, don't they then, through competition, induce people to try to do better?
If the individuals are relatively equal and have relatively equal power, then competition works, right? Because consumers that have equal resources and so forth, but that's not what we have in Chicago, and it's not what we have in the United States.
Well, we spend $15,000 per kid per year. Would you like to be equal and say, give every parent that $15,000 in purchasing power They could stay in the public school if they like. If they want, they could go to the private school of their choice. Every parent would be equal. Every parent would have $15,000 in purchasing power.
Yeah.
Would you be tempted?
I'd be tempted, but then I'd want to bargain for things like Head Start for everybody. I'd want about.
Well, people say the evidence is it doesn't work.
Oh, I think the evidence is pretty good that
Is
Head
it?
Start
Well,
works.
why are only 20% of the kids in the CPS reading at grade level? Haven't we had a Head Start here before?
I don't think we have it comprehensively and
been-
starting early enough.
I think we've had it for a while.
Yeah, and we
4 or
need more
5
of
years.
it. Yeah.
But it's not working because in 4th grade they should be 80% of the kids should be reading at grade level.
Well, could be.
All right. So where does this leave us? We've only got a few minutes left. Let me ask you. We've sort of gone all over the map. We've gone from fiscal policy, monetary policy, we've gone through Barack Obama, we've gone through sequestration. We haven't touched on the fiscal cliff. We haven't touched on the national debt, the debt limit, expanding the debt limit. Give people some advice. It's March 6, 2013. They'll be seeing this probably a week later.
Right.
How does this stuff all play out? Now, you know economics, you know public policy, but you've been around the block once or twice, so you know some politics.
Yes.
Tell them, in your view, putting it all together, political economy, how does it play out if they're trying to say, what's the world going to look like in the United States in the economy in June of 2013?
Yeah, it'll probably look just about the same because it is a political issue more than an economic issue. This sequestration, it's hard for me to say, fiscal cliff, debt limit, these are all gimmick, artificial roadblocks to rational discussion like we're having about, do you spend more money here, do you spend more money there, do you cut taxes and let people have, but those kinds of discussions are the kinds of discussions that you should be having. All of this fiscal cliff, sequestration, debt limit stuff is proxies for Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other, and this divided government that we have. And it'll stay divided until the next congressional election, and that may
Some people say, consistent with what you said, and we know Barack. Barack's been on this show, was on the show 6 times. He's a good guy. We'd love to have him on again. Maybe it'll happen sometime. Okay, a guy can hope, okay? But some people say, well, what he's doing now is he's trying to hammer the Republicans, get himself, he's got a Democratic Senate, get himself a Democratic House.
Right.
Then in the last 2 years of his administration, he can get what he wants. Right. Do you think that's what he's doing?
I hope that's what he's doing.
You're saying that'd be rational.
That'd be a rational
Because you're
thing.
saying there's no way the Republicans and Democrats are just not going to deal with each other.
I don't think so. It doesn't.
One has to get control and then run with the ball.
Yeah.
And in your view, it'd be best if the Democrats got control.
Yes, I would rather.
You're a Democrat.
I would rather have the economy.
Are you a Democrat?
I would rather have the economy of Bill Clinton, Lyndon Johnson, Franklin
Are
Roosevelt.
you a Democrat? Would you put
Yes,
yourself? Okay.
yes.
You're somebody who supported Bill Clinton for president.
Yes.
You're somebody who supported
Certainly.
Barack Obama.
Yes.
When you teach economics at Northeastern Illinois University, is that a problem?
It is a problem, and I try to use a textbook. Actually, the textbook I use is written by Greg Mankiw, who teaches at Harvard, who was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Bush, and was one of McCain's advisors, and also was one of Romney's advisors. So I try to give students a little bit of a different opinion than what they might get.
Do you let them know your own views, your own bias, and say you're
Yes.
trying to balance things out?
Right, right. I think that's the right thing to do. One of the great economists of all time, Joan Robinson, said there's no such thing as an objective economist, but you can have an objective library.
And so that's what do you give them a view of monetarism? Do you say, here's another view?
Yeah, and I point them to Friedman's work and John Taylor, whom I've met when he was in the White House for George H.W. Bush.